Hey, it's the Welcome Mat here. Let's talk Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Spoilers. If you have not read or understood it, just to be clear, this is a spoiler review. We will be talking about what happens in the book. So you've been warned. Now, let's dive into it. Growing up, I always enjoyed stories with time travel. Particularly enjoyed Back to the Future, for example, and even though there's a few things in that movie where you could gripe about the time travel, overall it makes sense. The movie has the idea of how the time travel works in that dynamic, and you understand it. It's funny because if you look back at the third Harry Potter, the Prisoner of Azkaban, and you watch the movie, you read the book, and you see how they use time travel, there are videos and articles that have joked about how why didn't they use that to go back in time and stop Voldemort from killing Harry's parents, or why didn't they just go back even to when Dumbledore met Voldemort at the children's orphanage and just killed him then? And it's kind of dark to think about, but at the same time, it's like, oh, well, that would have stopped all this bad from happening. So, like, it's interesting to think about. Well, this book addresses some of that problem in that it brings the time turners back. And it brings it back in a way that makes sense because you understand how Albus and Scorpius, particularly Albus, would probably want to please his father and do something great like he did. And it's really interesting, this book, because even though you can't really get into the head of the characters as much since it's a play and not like a really fleshed out novel like the other books were, you understand where they're coming from psychologically because you know Harry and you know Draco and you know the circumstances. And so even though we didn't get to know the characters as deeply, I feel like I knew them enough and I knew enough of their background to know what some of their struggles would have been like. And I found one of the most interesting things of this novel to be that dynamic of, well, what would it be like for someone really famous like Harry Potter, who's gone through all this tragedy, to have a child, and what would his children struggle with? What would their lives look like? The same thing for Draco. I hadn't really thought about that as much for Draco, but it's interesting to think about, and especially when you see all the gossip and rumor weed surrounding him, involving, oh, did Draco's wife have this child of Voldemort, and that's his child Scorpius or whatever, and it's really, it really makes you think about how easy it is in our world to people pass along a rumor about something, and that rumor can taint their reputation even if they did nothing wrong, and you really have to put aside those rumors until you get to the facts and you get to know, is this true about this person? And it's an interesting thing to think about, just how easily we can be manipulated by just the overwhelming volume of people who may push us in a certain direction, and particularly towards Draco, because Draco was a Death Eater, and so of course everyone was skeptical of him, sort of like they were towards Snape. There's some kind of history repeats itself type stuff there, but and that's one thing I love too, is how Draco and Harry reconciled. And as a Christian, reconciliation is a big deal to me. The Bible talks about in Corinthians how God is imploring us to be reconciled to himself and through Christ. And I love how there's that imagery of like enemies becoming friends and becoming, whole in their relationship. We're not meant to be at war, we're meant to be at peace with one another, and that's only possible through Jesus. But I think the story reflects elements of that, like putting aside the war, and there's finally reconciliation between them, which for some people may be like, wow, like they hated Draco and they despised him just because he was kind of always the coward and the snobby speaking bad things kid or whatever. I thought it was beautiful though. That was one of my favorite things in the book. I wish we'd had more into the mind of Harry, but I enjoyed what we saw, and I think you understand his character. You see how he's matured. You see his struggles as a father, just providing for his family and dealing with his past, and trying to raise his son. And you sympathize with him because many of us have had moments where we said really careless things to the ones who are closest to us, and just how painful those things can be, but yet how they can be healed. And I love how even through Albus's mistakes, there's still like, you know, almost like grace, like where he gets insight and enlightenment into his relationship with his father, and just understanding through it. I loved that the alternate realities. I loved how you saw Ron and Hermione. They still liked each other, even, and you know, even wanted to be together. It felt like, even though that didn't happen in that first alternate reality, because Ron married the girl he went to the Triwizard Ball with. I loved how you saw Umbridge being headmaster again, and of course, you know, we hate the thought of that, but like that was a really dark alternate reality, and so I thought that was interesting. I love how you get to see both of the boys be the hero in a sense, and especially Scorpius at the end really comes through, and I love the idea of seeing their friendship together. You know, how they would have come together because of their background, their past, and who they were. And in terms of negatives, though, I mean, there were certain parts that felt fan fiction-ish, if I could use that phrase, like Voldemort Day. But at the same time, I was like, well, if Voldemort had lived and killed Harry Potter and all this stuff, of course he's so arrogant, he would, you know, want a day named after himself, and everyone would praise him and stuff out of fear, and just out of fear, a bad kind of fear. And so I was like, okay, that's okay. I thought, though, that you could argue it was a plot hole when the two boys are at the scene at the day of when Voldemort came and killed Lily and James and tried to kill Harry, and they mess with the blanket, and then Harry sees that, you know, almost like 40 years later. It was kind of like logically like, well, if they had messed with this blanket and if they had been there, well, what happened to the boys, and what would that have done to history, just to even change all that time that was between when Harry sees the blanket. And so there's kind of like, well, you could say that was a plot hole. It definitely is, but if you know, just want to take things as they are for the sense of drama and tension, it's always very difficult when you're getting into time travel to really have something that makes complete coherent sense. And so I think for the sake of just storytelling, you have to put that aside. And that's just kind of one of the unfortunate things that can drag you down with time travel stories. But if that doesn't bother you, I think that the story still has a lot of twists in it. I love how you find out the cursed child was Voldemort's daughter from Bellatrix. And of course, if there was anyone who would have, you know, been with Voldemort, it would have been Bellatrix Lestrange. And it just makes you despise her even more. And I love that moment in the movies where you see Mrs. Weasley like stand up for her daughter and, you know, fight her off, and it's just so satisfying. Maybe even a little more so, just thinking like, man, she produced the offspring of Voldemort. So I like that. I think the ending was a little anticlimactic. Everything happened really fast, and there's, you know, that was, I mentioned in my other review, like one of the downsides of reading a play is there wasn't a moment to just let it sink in when you find out this cursed child is not Scorpius, it's the girl, and you just, you know, sink in what's happening. And it was really confusing what it was meaning when it said she got stuck in time and stuff, so a little bit towards the end it felt kind of blurry to me, but most of the way through the book I enjoyed it, and I couldn't put it down. I still had that, you know, Harry Potter magical, you know, just feeling engrossed in that world. And for that, I definitely would recommend the book. So the main things, though, that came through for me were prejudice, and particularly prejudice against, you know, celebrities. That was interesting to think about, and children, particularly celebrity children, and how we let rumors affect our perception of people, and thinking about those things. Reconciliation with Harry and Draco. And there's some other themes too. I felt like most of the characters, you felt like that was the character. A few people may be upset that they kind of tainted Amos Diggory because we didn't really have a lot of time with him, and what they did to his character can be disappointing, especially the alternate reality where you see Cedric became a Death Eater or something. He did something terrible in that one of those alternate realities, and but I love how they brought in some cameos, like they brought in Snape, which unfortunately, Alan Rickman has passed away, and so if they were to do eventually a movie version of this, unfortunately he wouldn't be able to reprise that role, and man, he just did such a great job with that character. But you really, like, that's a good moment when you see his reaction to finding out that Harry in this other reality named his child after him, and like it just brings even more satisfaction to me to what happened there with Snape, and even a little bit more closure to it. And there's a few other cameos. There's a couple of scenes that they take you back through, like Hagrid seeing Lily and James, and you see the moment of different twists on certain scenes of, oh, this isn't how I remembered it and stuff, and that was really interesting, like particularly with Aunt Petunia in the graveyard with Harry. I thought that was interesting to think about too, like how they never would have taken him to the graveyard. And yeah, there's just so much more you could talk about, but I love how they tease you with Voldemort, and he was there but he wasn't really there. Like you hear him whispering Harry Potter, and you're like, oh, he's back, like, and you're like terrified. You're like, when's it gonna happen? And then it doesn't really happen. I don't think there's a single line of new dialogue from Voldemort. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, I can't remember. But man, that was I thought that was brilliant, and I liked it because I felt like it didn't cheapen all that they went through to defeat Voldemort, and it didn't just erase everything and say, oh, we're just gonna bring him back, y'all. Like, he didn't really die. Like, some books and movies will do that. Like, they have a big baddie come around and he's so epic and awesome, and you just have to keep finding ways to reincarnate and bring him back in. And I think there can be ways that can be done, and I thought this was one way that was brilliant. Like, you brought him back, but you didn't bring him back, and it didn't undo everything. And life just goes on, and there's still more that could be written about Harry Potter, but I thought it was still satisfying in and of itself. I didn't feel like I needed to know more necessarily what happened with his characters, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, that I wasn't left really wanting to know that much more. I felt like I knew what I wanted to know about Albus and Scorpius, and maybe that's just because I haven't seen them on screen, or because I've only spent one book with them, and that was only part of the book. They kind of switched the main character sort of throughout the book. But those are some of my thoughts. Love to hear your comments below if you love to add anything to the discussion. I found too, as a final thought, one of the most interesting things in this book was that there was some decisions I felt like where it came down to not being a good versus bad decision, but a good versus best decision. And I mean, it's just an ethical quandary that presents itself in a few places. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. As a Christian, I find that sometimes in life, a lot of our difficult decisions cannot just be sinful decisions, but good things versus the best things. And when we make those good things into God things, and we make them more important and valuable than they should be, or exalt them in importance and the amount of time they take up in our lives. But anyways, those are my thoughts on Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Love to hear your thoughts below. Thanks so much. This has been The Welcome Mat. Have a good one. Bye-bye.